There's something about ships that survives long after their final voyage, something that clings to them like sea salt to aging wood. You see it in the rust-streaked portholes, hear it in the groan of steel shifting with the temperature of the day. The RMS Queen Mary is one of those ships, grand, silent, and still very much alive in all the wrong ways. Tourists who come to see her in Long Beach often marvel at her size, 1 to 19 feet of faded glory, but few linger alone after dark. Even fewer dare to descend into her lower decks, where time seems frozen and the air inexplicably colder. She looms over the harbor like a forgotten monument, her 3 red and black smokestacks rising against the California sky like watchful sentinels. Locals have grown used to her shadow, but sailors, veterans, and sensitives say the ship never truly docked. "She's still at sea," whispered one old engineer who once maintained the boiler rooms. "Just not this one." Built in the golden age of transatlantic luxury, the Queen Mary was more than just an ocean liner. She was Britain's pride, a technological marvel, a floating castle that once carried the world's wealthiest elite across the Atlantic in unprecedented style. When she launched from the Clyde in Scotland in 1934, the world took notice, not just of her elegance, but her presence. There was a gravity to her, even then, a mass not measured in tons, but in destiny. She set sail on her maiden voyage in 1936, slicing through the ocean like a blade of ambition. Aboard her were men in tuxedos, women draped in silks, orchestras playing under gold-leaf ceilings. She was the manifestation of an era that believed in opulence as a virtue. Yet even in her prime odd things were said, lights that flickered with no cause, echoes in empty halls, a child crying just out of earshot, always out of sight. It was dismissed, of course. Rich people don't believe in ghosts, they hire someone to explain them away. But the Queen Mary was already listening, already keeping, already taking. When war broke out in 1939, her velvet and crystal were stripped away, her shining decks painted grey. The Queen Mary became the grey ghost, and this is where the real story begins. Because while the war would end, the shadows it cast would not. She was fast, so fast in fact, that no German U-boat could catch her. Hitler reportedly put a bounty on her hull, a prize for any submarine captain who could sink her, but none succeeded. She zigzagged through enemy waters, ferrying more than 800,000 troops during the course of the war. She carried Churchill himself. She was a war machine in a bull gown's bones, but every victory comes at a price. In 1942, off the coast of Ireland, the Queen Mary collided with her escort, the HMS Curacoa. It wasn't sabotage, nor an attack. It was a miscalculation, a mistake. The Queen Mary, by protocol, was forbidden to stop in dangerous waters even after the collision, so she kept going. Her propellers churned the sea red behind her, while the Curacoa sank with 337 souls aboard. Survivors, scattered in oil-slicked waves, watched her silhouette vanish into the horizon, massive, indifferent, almost alive. Witnesses claim the Queen Mary let out a sound that night, something that wasn't metal, something almost like grief. From that moment, she was changed. Even the crew spoke of a heaviness on board, a presence that grew stronger with each crossing. Men started to report things, a shadow that passed too quickly, whispers in the dormitories, entire sections of the ship where radios failed and time seemed to slip. By the time the war ended, the Queen Mary had become a legend, but not just for her service. No one said it aloud, but those who sailed her began to understand. Some passengers never left. And then there's the pool. Oh, the pool. But we're not ready for that yet. You need to understand, this ship isn't haunted because people say it is. It's haunted because something is still moving inside her. Not walking, not breathing, but aware, watching, waiting. Tonight, the Queen Mary rests silently under the California moon, but she is not still. Her decks remember the press of hurried boots. Her corridors echo the footsteps of a man crushed by door 13, his face pale and crushed, his eyes somehow still searching. In the ballroom, the chandelier sways without wind, as if some grand waltz never truly ended. And as we go deeper into her story, we'll find that the Queen Mary is not just the setting of ghost stories. She is the ghost story. She was born not in silence, but in storm. The RMS Queen Mary's construction began during a time of economic desperation. The Great Depression choked nations in uncertainty, and yet, from the Clydebank shipyards of Scotland, rose this colossal vision of defiance and pride. Cunard White Star Line poured everything into her, their fortune, their hopes, and perhaps, unknowingly, their fears. They believed they were building a ship that would transcend time, and maybe, in a twisted way, they succeeded. When she was launched in 1934, crowds gathered like pilgrims. They say the wind changed that day, sharply and without warning, as her hull touched the sea for the first time. A gust so strong it rattled the windows of nearby homes and sent the flags flapping, as though saluting something ancient, something waking. Superstition whispered through the crowd, quickly drowned out by brass bands and royal speeches. But a few noticed. The seagulls had gone silent. Her interiors were beyond opulent. Walnut paneling, gold trim, hand-carved staircases, Art Deco embellishments on nearly every surface. The Queen Mary wasn't just a ship, she was a statement of power, of elegance, of man's dominion over the oceans. Passengers aboard her maiden voyage in May 1936 included aristocrats, movie stars, and business tycoons. They drank champagne under crystal chandeliers, danced in the grand ballroom where the floor subtly tilted to match the motion of the waves, and walked miles of promenade deck in furs and pearls. But even then, subtle things marred the perfection. A steward disappeared midway through that first journey. No alarm was raised. Officially, he'd been dismissed for misconduct and removed at an earlier port. Yet multiple guests swore they saw him serving drinks the night after. One woman, an heiress known for her eccentricities, claimed he entered her cabin without a key. He just walked through the door, she told her friends at breakfast, pale and trembling. She never returned to the ship again. By the end of her first year in service, rumors began to creep along her corridors like mist. Musicians spoke of phantom chords in the early morning hours, as if someone were tuning an invisible violin. Room stewards reported lights turning on in locked cabins. A chambermaid fled her station after hearing a baby cry for hours in a sealed storage room, only to find it empty, save for a rattle left on the floor, one that hadn't been there earlier. There's an old superstition among sailors. Some ships are just born wrong. No matter how beautiful, no matter how well built. It's something in the keel, they say, something in the first spark of welding flame that binds more than just steel. Some vessels attract more than passengers. The Queen Mary, despite or because of her luxury, was not exempt. As she grew in fame, passengers began to report strange dreams while aboard. Dreams of drowning, of corridors that looped endlessly, doors that wouldn't open or opened into pitch-black water. One businessman jumped overboard during her third voyage, shouting, "She's under the sea! She's under the sea!" just before vanishing into the Atlantic foam. His body was never found. A letter later discovered in his suite described a sense of being watched through the mirror. The mirror was removed. It now resides in storage, unpolished, covered. It wasn't just passengers. Crewmen, too, began to speak in hushed tones. Deckhands refused to enter certain sections alone. The starboard-aft staircase was said to echo even when no one was on it. And once, during heavy fog, a crew member claimed to see a wet footprint appear one step at a time, going upward. All these tales were contained, managed, and dismissed. After all, who would believe ghost stories on the world's most glamorous liner? It was easier to blame the ocean air, the long nights, the vintage spirits. And yet, certain protocols were unofficially adopted. Never open cabin B340 alone. Don't speak to the girl on deck G after midnight. And if you hear music in the infirmary after hours, don't follow it. But nothing could stop the tide of history. In 1939, as war spread across Europe like a black stain, the Queen Mary's days of elegance were stripped away. The golden handrails, the velvet drapes, the crystal chandeliers, all removed or locked away. She was repainted grey, outfitted for war, and reborn as a vessel of necessity. Her passengers now were not nobles, but soldiers, some hopeful, some terrified. And it was during this transition that the Queen Mary stopped being a ship of dreams and became something far more complex, far darker. In 1940, during a quiet night in harbour, a shipyard worker performing final checks before her departure vanished. His body was found 3 days later inside one of the sealed compartments, his face contorted in horror, fingernails torn from clawing the bulkhead. No one could explain how he got there. His name was James Harrow. The compartment, since then, is referred to by some of the crew as Harrow's Hold. No official records acknowledge it, but guides have seen the markings scratched into a steel support beam. JH, still inside. Some say that was the moment the Queen Mary became truly haunted. Not by death, but by something else. A presence that grew with each crossing, feeding on emotion, on memory, on the fear of thousands packed into her steel belly. She was no longer just a ship. She had become a collector, and her collection was only beginning. War doesn't ask, it takes. And when it came for the RMS Queen Mary, it took not only her grandeur, but something deeper, something fragile and vital. Her velvet walls were stripped, chandeliers crated away, her mahogany elegance buried beneath layers of regulation grey paint. But it wasn't just aesthetic, it was identity. She no longer carried laughter and orchestra music. She now carried dread. As 1939 turned into 1940, the Queen Mary was conscripted into service. No longer a vessel of leisure, she became a ghost of her former self, a steel leviathan tasked with ferrying troops through treacherous waters. Her new nickname, the Grey Ghost, was given by those who claimed to see her appear from fog like a spectre, massive, silent, and uncatchable. She was faster than any enemy submarine, cruising at speeds up to 32 knots, making her nearly untouchable. Hitler himself reportedly offered $250,000 and the Iron Cross to any U-boat captain who could sink her. None succeeded. The Queen Mary evaded every torpedo, every trap, but what she couldn't escape of was herself. The interiors of the ship changed not only in design, but in feel. Gone were the airy salons and cozy cabins. Soldiers were packed in rows, hammocks strung over pipes, metal trays clattering in mess halls that once served caviar. The echoes became louder, more violent. Many of the men who boarded her didn't sleep. They couldn't. Not because of seasickness or nerves, but because the ship whispered. One surviving letter from a private stationed in her lower holds reads, "Something walks beneath us. It doesn't have boots. It's slower than a man, but it's always moving. I keep seeing shadows in the infirmary, and twice I've heard a woman crying in the pipes. There are no women on board." These stories became common, officially dismissed as stress, paranoia, or hallucinations brought on by fatigue. But a curious trend emerged. These sightings, these sensations, they weren't random. They clustered. Same decks, same rooms, same times, patterns. And then came the night of the collision, October 2nd, 1942. The Queen Mary was transporting nearly 10,000 American troops across the North Atlantic. Her escort, the light cruiser HMS Curacoa, was meant to shield her from attack. In fog and miscommunication, the Queen Mary, maintaining strict orders to never stop under threat of U-boats, sliced through the Curacoa amidships. The smaller vessel split in two like a toy, swallowed by the freezing sea in minutes. Witnesses aboard the Queen Mary described a tremor, a groan deep within her iron bones, and then screams, hundreds of them, fading into nothing as she continued onward. She was forbidden to stop. Not a single rescue attempt was made. And that is the wound she never recovered from. To this day, passengers and investigators report cries near the bow during fog, sounds of metal tearing, cold hands brushing ankles in the early morning hours. In room R212, where the structural damage was closest, several guests have reported water dripping from the ceiling when no pipes run above. One of the surviving Curacoa crewmen, a signal operator who barely made it onto a lifeboat, was asked years later about that night. He said only one thing before refusing to speak further. It wasn't the Queen Mary that hit us. It was something inside her. After the incident, crew records began to show transfers, dozens of them. Men requesting reassignment or simply going AWOL after just one voyage. One steward wrote in his journal, "I keep dreaming of eyes, not human eyes. They look through the metal. I think she's watching us now. Not the ship, the thing wearing it." And then, as if to confirm his dread, the next morning he vanished. His uniform was found folded on his bunk. His boots sat perfectly aligned, but he was gone. No note, no sighting, just gone. The war ended, and the Queen Mary was eventually restored to her former glory. The paint was scrubbed away, the decor returned, but those who knew her during wartime said she never felt the same. The lights flickered longer. The engines rumbled like a growl. The echo of boots on steel followed. There are records, quietly archived, that suggest entire sections of the ship were quietly sealed off after the war. Areas that had no structural damage, no mechanical fault. But people refused to go there. Rooms where the temperature wouldn't rise. Hallways that distorted sound. One report, buried in Cunard archives, tells of an electrician who went in to repair a circuit and emerged hours later, mute, not a word spoken since. The Queen Mary carried over 800,000 troops during the war. That is not just a number, it's an ocean of fear, longing, desperation and death, and emotions, if strong enough, do not fade. They soak into the walls. She became a container, and now, long after her final war mission, she's still full. Of what exactly? No one dares say. They call her haunted, but haunted implies something external, something that came aboard. What if it was always there? What if war didn't break her? What if war fed her? And now, returned to civilian life, she smiles in polished brass and glittering chandeliers. While beneath the decks, something shifts. Something waits, and perhaps something regrets ever being disturbed. There is a point in every story where coincidence becomes pattern, where accidents no longer feel random. And for the RMS Queen Mary, that threshold was crossed long ago. Her legacy isn't merely written in newspapers and naval records, it's carved in the metal of her hallways, hidden beneath layers of paint and protocol, whispered between sighs of steam and sighs of the long dead. What began as isolated incidents, brief flickers of something unseen, evolved into tragedy. Take, for instance, the case of John Pedder. A fireman, barely 20 years old, Pedder worked in the heart of the ship, the engine rooms. Hot, industrial labyrinths of steel and noise, where pressure gauges blinked like mechanical eyes and steam hissed in bursts like breath through clenched teeth. One afternoon during a routine drill, John was assigned to operate Door 13, a massive watertight door designed to seal shut in emergencies. According to reports, he misjudged the timing. He tried to pass through the door as it closed, a decision fatal in both theory and execution. The door crushed him mid-torso with a force so violent that crew members later described the scene as impossible to forget. His body was dragged out, but something stayed behind. Since that day, countless guests and crew have reported seeing a man in blue overalls wandering near Door 13. He is described as calm, almost unaware. Sometimes he's just standing. Other times, his face is turned as if listening. No one ever hears what he's hearing. When approached, he simply fades or walks through walls. In the boiler room nearby, a hotspot for paranormal activity, people speak of cold spots that move. That follow. Cameras malfunction. Tourists report being touched, hands on backs, necks, shoulders, only to turn and find no one. One guide, now retired, once led a midnight tour that ended prematurely when a child in the group began screaming, pointing at the shadows, saying, "The man with the broken stomach is crawling." Duh. They left immediately. But John Pedder is just the beginning. One of the most persistent stories revolves around the first-class swimming pool, now long drained of water, yet never truly dry. During her peak, it was a centerpiece of luxury. Marble walls, arched ceilings, soft lighting that shimmered across the rippling surface. Now, it is cold, not just in temperature but in presence. They say a little girl named Jackie drowned there. Some say she slipped, others that she was pulled. Her voice, however, remains. Investigators have captured EVP recordings of a young girl laughing, calling for her mother, singing nursery rhymes. One infamous recording features a voice, faint but chilling. "Can I go home now?" But the room won't let her. During night investigations, witnesses describe wet footprints appearing across the dry tiles. A ball, left intentionally for her, once rolled slowly across the floor against the incline. A lifeguard, who once worked in the area, claimed he often heard splashing when no one was there, and the sound of small hands tapping the drain covers from beneath. It said Jackie is not alone, that the pool room houses something else, older, angrier. Security guards refuse to enter alone. Some believe it's the spirit of a woman once locked in the steam room, accidentally, who was found hours later, eyes wide, nails bloody. She hadn't screamed. There were no marks on the door. But on the inside of the glass, a fogged message had been traced with a single word: stay. But not all deaths on the Queen Mary were accidents. In the 1950s, a young woman on honeymoon leapt from the top deck into the freezing Atlantic below. She was never found. Her room was locked, her belongings untouched. But inside the mirror, yes, that mirror, they found something etched with a fingernail. The number 44, repeated over and over. The significance remains unknown. But room B44 has since been sealed. Passengers assigned nearby have reported hearing knocks on the walls in patterns, rhythmic, intentional. Once, during an off-season refitting, a contractor swore he saw a pale hand reach from under the bed and pull the dust sheet taut. He quit that same day, leaving his tools behind. And then there is room B340, the Queen Mary's most infamous cabin. Locked for decades due to guest disturbances, it has only recently been reopened, allegedly remodeled for paranormal tourism. But those who have stayed report the same sequence of phenomena: lights flickering, covers pulled off while sleeping, the bathroom faucet turning on by itself, and most disturbingly, knocking. From the inside of the closet, 3 knocks, then silence, 3 knocks, then a voice, raspy, male, indecipherable, murmuring something like a prayer or perhaps a warning. But when the closet is opened, it's empty, always empty, except once. Only one photograph exists, taken by a tourist who fled the room after seeing a figure in the mirror. She took a photo over her shoulder as she ran. What it captured is difficult to explain. A tall, human-shaped mass, dark as night, with no features, just the faint outline of shoulders and a head. But more unsettling than its presence is its position. It wasn't looking at her, it was looking into the mirror. Some believe the Queen Mary collects not just souls, but their images, their echoes, that certain places within the ship serve as recording chambers, memory traps, looping moments of horror, fear, or longing, playing over and over again for those sensitive enough or cursed enough to witness them. You begin to understand. This ship is not merely haunted in the traditional sense. She is a reservoir, a psychological pressure cooker, a place where time and emotion bend, where grief lives in the wiring and regret hums through the pipes. And yet, this is only scratching the surface, because what lies beneath these tragedies is something older than the ship. A hunger, a presence that has grown smarter with time, and the deeper we go, the closer we get to whatever it is. There are places on the RMS Queen Mary where light doesn't behave the way it should, where shadows stretch too long, or bend the wrong direction, or flicker just outside the field of vision and vanish when turned toward. These are the corridors where you don't just feel watched, you feel studied. Paranormal investigators, mediums, and skeptics alike have walked these decks. Some come seeking answers, others come to disprove the myths, but nearly all of them leave with something they didn't bring, an unease that clings to their thoughts for weeks, months, sometimes longer. Because the Queen Mary doesn't need you to believe, she only needs you to listen, and listen people do, especially to the whispers of the ship's most infamous spirits. The one they call the Woman in White is often described as elegant, almost regal. She appears near the Queen's Salon, once a glittering ballroom where debutantes twirled and jazz orchestras filled the air. Witnesses say she moves gracefully, as if still caught in mid-dance, her face expressionless and eyes distant. Some see only a flash of her white gown slipping around a corner. Others claim to have seen her glide across the floor during private events, always alone, always fading, before reaching the far wall. A psychic medium who visited the ship in 1996 conducted a séance near the salon. He described her not as malevolent, but tragically unaware. "She doesn't know she's dead," he said. "She's just waiting for the song to finish." But during a later recording session in the same area, his audio equipment picked up a voice behind his narration. A female voice. It said, "No, I'm waiting for him." No one knows who he is, and perhaps we're better off not knowing. In the second-class nursery, now a museum exhibit, staff often report toys being moved overnight. Not small shifts, but complete rearrangements. A spinning top that rotates without touch. A rocking horse that creaks for hours when the room is locked and dark. Once, a baby monitor placed as part of a ghost tour captured the sound of a lullaby, off-key, mechanical, and unmistakably sung. But not all spirits are content to be seen or heard from afar. In the forward storage area, near what was once the ship's meat locker, a new entity has emerged in recent years. Nicknamed the Butcher, this presence is less a ghost and more a force. No one has ever seen a clear figure, but they've heard the dragging of chains, the sharp scrape of a cleaver against tile. The sudden drop in temperature, accompanied by the stench of raw flesh and decay. Security cameras positioned in this section often distort or shut down entirely between 3:07 and 3:11 a.m. every night. Always those exact 4 minutes. One former security guard, now retired and living under a pseudonym, gave a chilling interview. "You don't understand. Something in there didn't want to be filmed. I saw meat hooks swing without air. I heard my name from the darkness, not like an echo, like someone standing right next to me." He paused before continuing. "I quit the next day, and I've dreamed about a dark hallway every night since, but it's not on the ship. It's inside me now." Even more disturbing is the story of the man in the mirror, a figure so elusive yet so recurrent that entire investigations have focused on him. He appears not in hallways or rooms, but within mirrors, especially those aboard the original first-class suites, many of which still retain the original 1930s fixtures. Guests report seeing a man behind them as they brush their hair, shave, or simply pass by. A man with no eyes, just black, empty sockets. In one case, a woman screamed after seeing him during a bridal prep session. When her fiancé entered the room, the mirror had shattered, spiderweb cracks originating not from impact, but from inside the glass. The Queen Mary's crew avoids these stories in official capacity, but off the record, some admit they've seen things. One maintenance worker told a documentary team, "I won't go below deck F, not since I heard it breathing, the whole deck, in, out, like lungs the size of a building." And then there's the Elevator 5 incident. During a private overnight investigation in 2008, two paranormal researchers took separate elevators to test EMF interference across the ship. One of them, using Elevator 5, never emerged. Security footage shows him entering the lift. The doors close. 32 seconds pass. Then, nothing. No doors reopening, no descent or ascent. Just static. The elevator was later found on a maintenance floor, doors ajar, empty. His equipment was discovered 2 decks below, crushed flat in the corner of a narrow corridor that ends at a sealed bulkhead. No access points, no ladders, no explanation. The footage, quietly confiscated by hotel management, has become urban legend, dubbed the vanishing tape by insiders. Only a single freeze frame ever leaked. It shows the investigator staring at the mirror inside the elevator, but his reflection isn't his own. Skeptics say these are tricks of the mind. That old ship's creak that shadows play games. But even they admit the Queen Mary is unusually consistent. Spirits return to the same places, apparitions repeat the same gestures, and above all, they respond. If spoken to, they reply. If challenged, they react. And sometimes they follow. One couple from Nevada, who stayed in room B Deck 4 in 2014, claimed to return home only to find things in their house subtly wrong. Pictures tilted, doors opening at night. A child's laughter recorded on their Ring doorbell at 2:46 a.m. They returned to the ship the following year, not for closure, but for answers. They never made it past the entrance. The woman collapsed, her nose bleeding profusely, whispering, "It knows we left." They checked out that night. No refund requested. Because once the Queen Mary chooses you, it's not about belief. It's about resonance. Her spirits are not fleeting echoes. They're not residual loops. They're conscious, watching, waiting, and some perhaps want to leave, but cannot. The RMS Queen Mary no longer sails, but she still moves, not across oceans, but across minds, imaginations and realms no one can truly map. Permanently docked in Long Beach, California, she rests beneath the Pacific sun, a tourist attraction, hotel, museum, and for those who've felt her presence, something far more intimate, a living relic of unresolved time. She draws thousands each month, history buffs, thrill seekers, and ghost hunters armed with thermal cameras, EVP recorders, motion sensors, and apps that promise communication with the dead. In a world that craves proof, the Queen Mary offers something more dangerous, possibility. Tours guide the curious through dimly lit corridors, into staterooms frozen in 1936 opulence, and down into the bowels of the ship, where rivets still bleed rust and the air tastes metallic. The guides, well-trained and polished, tell stories that flirt with fear but remain carefully scripted. What they don't say is what happens when the lights go off, when the guests leave, when the decks fall quiet again. Staff, long-term employees, not seasonal hires, share whispers behind closed doors, stories that never make it to the brochures. One janitor speaks of voices over the intercom after midnight, in a language no one recognizes. A hotel concierge once quit after he answered a 3 a.m. call from room B340, which had no guests, no reservations, and had been padlocked for weeks. He claims he heard breathing. Then, "I'm still waiting." EVP sessions, once fringe science, have become the norm here. Ghost hunting groups pay handsomely for after-hours access, and the results are unsettling. One group captured a full sentence, clear and chilling. "Don't look in the water." When they reviewed their footage, a shadow moved across the porthole behind them, but they were docked. No water outside. Another investigator, documenting temperature anomalies, tracked a moving cold spot that circled her for 13 minutes before suddenly vanishing. When she reviewed the thermal footage frame by frame, there was a silhouette, humanoid, eyeless, trailing her by inches. It was never seen by her naked eye. Technicians working on the Wi-Fi infrastructure report frequent outages in specific zones: Deck F, Engine Room 2, and the isolation ward, areas long associated with sightings. Signal equipment melts down, hard drives corrupt. One laptop belonging to a YouTuber reviewing live EMF data glitched and displayed a single phrase in looping binary. When translated, it read, "I remember the cold. Skeptics insist it's coincidence. Bad wiring, environmental interference." But why does it always center around the same spots? Why does the tech fail only when the entity is said to appear? And then there are the guests who don't believe, the ones who mock, dare, provoke. One such man, a self-proclaimed debunker, live-streamed his overnight stay in room B340, laughing, knocking on walls, calling out, "Come on, ghost, scare me!" He fell asleep sometime around 3 a.m., camera still running. At 3:17, the camera captured something else, the bed covers lifting on one side, slowly, deliberately. Then something crawled into the bed beside him. Not a full form, just the imprint of weight pressing into the mattress like an invisible child laying down. The stream cut out. He left the ship before dawn, visibly shaken, and later deleted all content from his channel. He never spoke publicly again. But another investigator, watching the live feed that night, recorded the footage. At the 3:19 mark, the man is seen waking suddenly, eyes wide. He doesn't look at the bed. He looks at the camera, straight into the lens, and says, "Don't trust the mirrors." Then smiles. It wasn't his smile. Reports like this grow, not just from thrill seekers, but from average families, staff, engineers. The Queen Mary has become an ecosystem of mystery, a place where energy loops, echoes compound, and something listens. And perhaps the most disturbing part? Sometimes she changes. Maps of the ship, especially the older ones, don't always match the current layout. Passages are longer than they should be. Some doors appear where there were none. Guests speak of taking a turn and ending up somewhere unfamiliar, though they'd walked that route before. One woman, searching for the engine room tour, ended up in a corridor that wasn't listed on any deck plan. It had 6 doors, all marked 13. None of them opened. When she turned back, the hallway was gone. Some researchers now theorize that the ship isn't just haunted, it's aware, that it's evolving, folding itself into something greater, something more complex than simple ghosts or trapped souls. In other words, the Queen Mary isn't the vessel, she's the host. And this host chooses who sees what, who hears the whispers, who never finds their way back. But through it all, she remains undeniably seductive, a cursed siren in steel and wood. She lures people not just with fear, but with fascination. She wants to be known, and yet never fully revealed, because what's hidden at the heart of the Queen Mary is not just a haunting, it's a revelation waiting to be unlocked. The Queen Mary has no shortage of stories, but stories, however chilling, are easy to doubt. What's harder to dismiss is the evidence, the captured voices, the shadows caught on camera, the inexplicable technical failures that plague nearly every serious investigation on board. In a world driven by documentation, the Queen Mary seems to challenge investigators to catch her in the act, and she often responds in kind, as if testing the limits of belief, or perhaps choosing who deserves a glimpse behind the veil. Let's begin with the EVPs, or electronic voice phenomena. Across dozens of investigations over the years, these disembodied recordings, not heard at the time, only later upon playback, have surfaced with eerie consistency. They vary in tone and message, but several phrases have appeared across unrelated themes, in different years, in different locations. It's cold. Don't open it. She's watching you. He never left the water. I'm still in the mirror. Some of the clearest EVPs come from the first-class swimming pool and the infirmary, both of which have long since been out of use. These aren't garbled noises open to interpretation. They are full sentences, emotionally charged, occasionally responding to questions. One investigator, conducting a call and response near the engine room, asked, "Is anyone here with us?" The reply, recorded clearly on 2 separate devices. "Behind you." He turned. No one there. But the footage shows his shadow briefly lengthen, as if someone stepped between him and the light. Then there's the visual evidence. Skeptics often argue that photos can be doctored or misinterpreted, tricks of light, reflections, dust. But the Queen Mary has produced images that resist explanation. A tourist once captured a photo of the ship's main staircase. At first glance, it appeared normal, but zoomed in, just behind the railing, is a face, not transparent, not obscured. Perfectly clear, a man in a 1940s naval uniform, expression blank. The image was analyzed by photography experts. No signs of digital manipulation, no anomalies in light refraction. He simply shouldn't be there. And yet, he is. That same face was later matched, with 83% facial recognition confidence, to a documented crew member, Lieutenant Charles B. Dean, lost during a supply accident in 1944. Official records state his body was never recovered. Then, there are the cold spots. These aren't mild temperature drops. We're talking pockets of air that plummet from 72 degrees to 35 degrees within seconds, with no drafts, vents, or mechanical sources to explain the shift. More bizarrely, these cold spots often move, tracking investigators as they walk. Some have reported nausea, headaches, even temporary blackouts when standing inside them too long. Thermal imaging shows something else: voids, not simply cold, but absent. Areas where heat signatures disappear entirely, as if the sensors were peering into something that absorbs warmth, energy, presence. One expert from a university in Northern California called the data thermally impossible. Yet it happened, repeatedly. And what about motion sensors, you ask? They activate in sealed rooms, sometimes with patterns. In a test conducted in 2017 by a team of engineers, infrared motion detectors were placed in B-deck corridor, a section closed to guests due to fire hazard renovations. Over 3 nights, the sensors picked up movement, always between 2:45 and 3:10 a.m., back and forth, like pacing. When they checked the footage, the corridor was empty, except for the final night. At 3:04 a.m., a shape entered frame. No features, just height, mass, movement. The cameras, for reasons still unclear, failed to register it as a person. No facial ID, no temperature. But the sensors confirmed motion, repeated, deliberate. Some speculate this shape is what staff now refer to unofficially as the Watcher. A presence not tied to any one room, but observed across multiple decks, always seen at a distance, always just out of reach, as if it's not caught, but choosing to be seen. Critics insist it's all explainable. Old wiring, EMF spikes, pareidolia, collective hysteria. But explain this. A retired ship electrician once returned for a paranormal convention, lured by curiosity. He'd spent 30 years maintaining systems aboard the Queen Mary. He knew every cable, every duct. He didn't believe. During his visit, he stood alone near the third-class promenade deck, a section he'd rewired himself decades ago. And he heard it. A voice. His own voice. "You shouldn't have come back." There were no other speakers, no recordings running. And yet the voice came again, this time distorted, like it was being played back from memory, not tape. He collapsed. Heart attack. Survived. Later in the hospital, he asked if anyone had seen the woman in the fog. There had been no fog that night. There are reports like these stacked in archives, filed away in manila folders by hotel management under labels like guest incident, unverified, and internal anomaly, dismissed. But no matter how many are dismissed, the pattern remains. Voices without speakers, movements without bodies, cold that has no source, and guests who leave changed. Because the Queen Mary doesn't just haunt your stay, she haunts after. The Queen Mary exists in two realities. One, the physical, a floating artifact of 20th century achievement, welded steel and maritime precision, decks polished for tourists, history chronicled in guided tours and museum placards. And the other? That one's harder to define. A psychological architecture built not of rivets, but of experiences, countless reports of footsteps, voices, visions, sensations. It's not just haunted rooms and midnight knocks, it's a presence, a knowing. But is the RMS Queen Mary truly haunted? The question demands more than a simple yes or no, because what we face here is not just about ghosts, it's about us. Let's begin with psychology. Human beings are pattern seekers. We're hardwired to connect dots, to find meaning in the meaningless. A door slams from air pressure. We imagine footsteps. Lights flicker from a loose wire. We picture eyes watching in the dark. Psychologists call this pareidolia, seeing faces in clouds, figures in shadows. It's not delusion. It's survival instinct, rooted in a time when misinterpreting rustling grass as wind instead of a predator could cost your life. Now place that instinct inside the Queen Mary, a ship with layers of history, grief, and rumor. A ship where you've heard the stories, seen the documentaries, read the accounts. You step into her corridors primed for fear, conditioned to hear whispers. Expectation becomes perception, fear becomes validation. But here's where it gets more complex. Because even when controlling for these factors, even when guests are not told where they are or what is supposed to happen in a given room, they still report the same sensations. Cold spots, flickering lights, an overwhelming sense of being watched. Is this mass hysteria, or is it something else? There's a theory among parapsychologists called the stone tape theory. The idea that extreme emotional energy can imprint onto physical surroundings, like trauma recorded onto magnetic tape. Stone, wood, even metal, these materials absorb and replay the energy, not intelligent ghosts, but residual echoes of powerful human experiences. And if ever a ship absorbed such emotion, it was the Queen Mary. War, fear, death, despair. These weren't momentary, they were constant. Thousands of terrified soldiers packed into her lower decks, generations of passengers carrying secrets, regrets, guilt, emotions not resolved but sealed into steel. Could the ship be playing these back to us? But then, there's something more. Some reports don't align with simple energy replay. They adapt, they interact. One couple described a voice responding to questions. Another spoke of a spirit that knew their names, though they had never spoken them aloud. And there are stories, so many stories, of entities that follow, that appear in dreams days later, that manifest outside the ship. This is where the skeptic's foundation begins to crack. If the Queen Mary is haunted only by suggestion, then why do hardened non-believers leave visibly shaken? Why do their cameras glitch at the same coordinates night after night? Why do they have the same dreams? And why, above all, do they so often return? Could it be that we want the ship to be haunted? There is a seductive power in belief. Not religious faith, but narrative belief. The need for mystery, for the unknown, for the thrill of brushing against something greater. The Queen Mary becomes a mirror. She shows us what we expect to see. To some, she is history, to others, horror. And in that duality, she becomes more than either. Consider this: if belief can shape perception, and if enough people believe the Queen Mary is haunted, does she become so by sheer collective will? Is it possible the ship was never haunted? Not in 1936, not in 1942, but that over decades of stories, fear, curiosity, and reverence, we've built her into a haunting, a thought form, known in occult circles as a tulpa, an entity created by belief, sustained by attention. If that's the case, then we didn't find ghosts on the Queen Mary. We created them, but this raises a darker possibility. What if our belief didn't create harmless echoes, but something far more responsive? Something that listens, learns, and molds itself into whatever we most fear. Something not born of the ship, but now living within it. Not a ghost, but a conscious haunting. One that doesn't wait to be discovered. One that waits to discover you. There is one final chilling observation made by a parapsychologist who spent a full month aboard. He catalogued hundreds of anomalies, but his conclusion wasn't about any individual ghost, any piece of evidence. It was about the ship itself. The Queen Mary, he wrote, does not contain the haunting. She is the haunting. And with that, he never returned. So, is she haunted, or is she now something entirely new? A living archive of human experience, feeding off belief, manifesting terror with surgical precision? We may never truly know. And perhaps that is her most powerful trick. There is a strange alchemy in belief, an invisible transmutation of thought into experience, of expectation into sensation. On the Queen Mary, belief is not just a passive state of mind. It is a fuel, an invitation, and perhaps even a trigger. And what it awakens is not always gentle. You see, the Queen Mary is not haunted by chance. She is haunted by design. Whether intentional or not, the thousands of stories, documentaries, ghost tours, whispers in gift shops and late-night hotel lobbies, they have all worked together to weave a tapestry of myth so dense, so detailed, that it has taken on a shape, a form. And within that form, something now stirs. Science tells us our minds are suggestible. When primed by a narrative, a warning, a tale, a superstition, we begin to see the world differently. The scent of mildew becomes the perfume of the dead. A groan in the pipes becomes a child crying. Our minds make connections even when none exist, but something happens aboard the Queen Mary that goes beyond this. Even when no context is given, even when guests are blindfolded, unaware of their location, they report the same sensations in the same rooms. Dizziness in the infirmary, pressure in the boiler room, the feeling of being watched in the promenade corridors. These responses are patterned, too consistent to dismiss, too personal to replicate, and that's when we must confront the deeper question: what if belief doesn't just color perception? What if it creates reality? This is not new philosophy. Quantum physics suggests the observer can affect the observed. In occult traditions, concentrated thought creates tulpas, sentient entities formed from collective focus. Urban legends become egregores, autonomous ideas that evolve as more people feed them. Every prayer, every fear, every whispered ghost story told aboard the Queen Mary adds weight, adds presence. She is not just a ship, she is a mind field. And if the collective psyche of tens of thousands of people believes she is haunted, then perhaps something responds. Perhaps something comes through, not from the afterlife, not from beyond the veil, but from within us. The ship has become a mirror. Not one of silver and glass, but of thought and trauma. It reflects what we bring, magnified, personified. Those who carry grief see lost children. Those who carry guilt hear voices that know their secrets. Those who carry nothing often leave carrying something, and the Queen Mary makes no distinction. She does not choose skeptics over believers. She doesn't care if you're filming a documentary or celebrating an anniversary. If you step aboard, you've entered the current. And belief, conscious or not, begins to seep in. Even those who mock the idea, the so-called debunkers, aren't safe. In fact, they're often the most vulnerable, because in their dismissal, they let their guard down. And the Queen Mary, like a predator, seems to wait for that moment, to strike when disbelief becomes uncertainty, when there's no such thing turns into, but what if? And then the mirror shifts. Guests who arrive dismissive often leave shaken. Objects move, dreams shift. Mirrors show more than reflections, and some report feeling like they never fully left, that something followed them, that the Queen Mary remembered them. One man, a rationalist professor, documented his stay aboard in a skeptical podcast. His tone throughout the first hour is dry, scientific. He dismisses creaking noises, laughs at cold spots, but in the final segment, recorded just before disembarking, he sounds different. His voice is slower. He says, "I looked in the mirror last night, and for a second, I wasn't there, not gone, but replaced. My face was still, my eyes weren't mine. I blinked and it was back, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm not the one leaving this ship." The podcast was never updated again. Belief, it seems, is not a shield, it is a channel. The more we believe, the stronger the Queen Mary becomes. She is not just haunted, she is haunting us back. And maybe she doesn't want us to be afraid. Maybe she wants us to participate, to belong. There is a passage carved behind the paneling of room B340, one not listed in schematics, found only during a restoration. It reads, "To know her is to feed her." No one knows who carved it. Some things feed on blood, others on sound. The Queen Mary feeds on attention, on stories, on belief. And if she has become sentient, if the ship's collected echoes, memories, traumas, and projections have coalesced into something alive, then perhaps we are not passengers or investigators anymore. We are worshippers of a cathedral not of stone, but steel, one with porthole eyes and engine room lungs. And somewhere deep in her hull, there is something listening still, something we've built with our fear and named it legend to make ourselves feel safe. But it's not a legend anymore. It's awake. Very well, you've traveled the length of her shadow, stood on her trembling decks and glimpsed behind the polished brass of memory. Now, let me take you to where the steel breathes, where time unravels, where she waits. Part 10. The Queen Mary's lasting legacy. You thought the end would bring answers, but endings on the RMS Queen Mary don't exist. They loop, they echo, they follow. She is docked, yes, still, motionless. But beneath that stillness, something pulses. The Queen Mary is not resting. She's feeding. You've heard the stories, you've seen the evidence, you've felt the psychological twist of a ship that mirrors your deepest fears. But now, let's imagine something worse. What if none of this is accidental? What if she wants you to believe, not to scare you, but to let you in? Because the Queen Mary doesn't just trap ghosts, she traps you, not your body, your presence. There are documented cases, dozens, of guests who leave but don't feel right afterward. Headaches that last weeks. Shadows that stretch wrong in the corners of their homes, dreams in which the corridors never end. And in every one of these dreams, no matter how the dreamer runs, they never find the exit, only deck 13, a deck that does not exist, or rather, that should not. No schematics show it, no blueprints list it. And yet, more than 100 people, investigators, guests, former staff, have described the same space. A narrow hallway lit by hanging cage lamps that flicker as you move. Doors marked with no numbers, a distant humming, rhythmic, mechanical. And behind one of those doors, something knocking, 3 times, every time. But no one who's reached that door remembers what came next. They wake, always at 3:13 a.m. And their clocks, their phones, their watches, all stop for exactly 13 minutes. Coincidence? Or is something being taken? There's one final account I've never shared. A former naval officer, now in his 90s, contacted a researcher anonymously. He had served on the Queen Mary during her military years and had seen, he said, something they were ordered to forget. Below Deck F, past the engine maintenance rooms, there had been an unauthorized passage, a chamber not listed in any naval documents. He and 3 other men were assigned to seal it after several crew disturbances. They entered with torches. No lights worked inside. He said the walls were not metal, not wood. Something else, warmer. It was like being inside something alive, and in the center of the chamber, a mirror, framed in iron, covered with a cloth bolted into the wall. They were told never to remove it, but they did, and what they saw he could not describe. Only this, his reflection smiled before he did. He blacked out. The next day, the room was welded shut, not sealed, erased. But he's never slept through the night since. Every dream ends with the same whisper, "Welcome back." This is the Queen Mary's legacy, not historical, but existential. A haunting not of ghosts, but of identity. She doesn't scare you with what you see. She scares you with what you recognize in yourself, the guilt, the fear, the hidden. She becomes the echo chamber for your most buried truths. She doesn't show you death, she shows you what waits after. And if you feel a chill right now, reading this, if something just moved in the reflection of your screen, don't look too closely. Because what if this story, this idea, this invitation, has already let her in? She's not just a ship. She's not just haunted. She's watching you read this. And she remembers.